With Twitter, Facebook, and blogs, many people's lives are an open book. But should government be? Well, today and tomorrow, Regina hosts the Saskatchewan 3.0 Summit. It looks at management and social technology. David Eaves is one of the guests. He advises a number of governments about becoming more open. To find out why, we've reached him at the summit in Regina. Thanks for your time today, Mr. Eaves.
Thank you for having me.
You're described as an open government activist. First off, do you like the description? And secondly, what does it mean?
So I do like the description. Sometimes I use public policy entrepreneur as well, mostly just to keep people on their toes. But, basically what I'm trying to do is work with governments and not always directly, and sometimes indirectly by writing, and just kind of talk about how sharing information and kind of openness in general can be a very effective tool to making governments more effective, and also around increasing accountability and improving trust between citizens and their governments.
Well, how should governments be more open?
So I think a lot of people, when they think of open government, often think of kind of the more gotcha style. It's like, let's find out a piece of information that embarrasses a minister or embarrasses the mayor, and that's what open government should mean. So you should be able to access those documents. And that is a very important part of open government, and I don't think we should ever lose sight of that. So that involves kind of access to information requests and pieces like that. But there's kind of another emerging part of the open government world, which is around how do we structure services and activities that government does in a way that citizens are more able to participate, and as a result, the services themselves become more efficient.
Maybe a somewhat cynical view, but it would appear that the track record is that that's an anathema to most governments, that they seem to be happiest if everything is sort of kept secret.
So sometimes that is true, and sometimes I actually think that ends up being true not because that's what government wants, but because actually the models for doing things differently aren't always clear to them. So one of the big examples, like just to really drive it home and become really, really pragmatic about this, is an example I often like to use involves something like restaurant inspection data. So, local health authorities inspect restaurants to assess, how clean they are and how safe they are. And often that type of information ends up on, if we're lucky, it ends up on a government website. So that becomes kind of the notion of open government is like, well, we shared the information on the website, our work here is done. And the frustrating thing about all that, of course, is that the only time I believe citizens ever end up on those websites is after they've been food poisoned. So you go to the website to find out, wow, did I get sick? Have they been caught before? Nobody actually uses the website to assess whether or not they should have gone to the restaurant in the first place. And so if we made the data more open and allowed, kind of restaurant inspection results to end up in people's mobile phones or even just posted on the front doors of restaurants, we already know that in places like LA, when they've done that, not only do more people go to restaurants that are rated well, fewer people go to restaurants that are rated more poorly, but the number of people who end up in the emergency room in the first year declined by 16% for foodborne-related illnesses. So it had a real cost savings around healthcare. And that's the kind of openness of information that I think if we were starting to think about it more strategically and think about it more differently, we could actually change people's lives, not in the gotcha politics kind of way, I think we can do that too, but in the much more practical, I don't want to get sick or I don't remember when my garbage day is type of way.
Well, if we use that example then, any government attempted to do that is going to face a pretty, strident lobby from the Restaurant Association, who certainly isn't going to want that sort of information to be that accessible. So how do governments weigh their priorities? So
my counter to that would be the data about the restaurants is actually a public asset. The data that the government collects about those restaurants, it's as public as the roads that we use or any other service the government offers. And so the question really shouldn't be by what right do they choose not to share that data. It's why isn't that data actually more available because my tax dollars paid to collect it. And that's the conversation I think we should be having with our governments, which is that they actually have an enormous amount of data, much of which could be very, very useful, that they don't share, and yet it's as much of a public asset as everything else. And I think governments get quite interested in stuff when they begin to realize that sharing that information can drive savings and create efficiencies. So that that data about restaurant inspections is already public. It's just not shared in a particularly useful way. So I'm not sure that the restaurant associations would come out in complaining because it's actually already there. The other thing is restaurants that do well, they actually get more customers. So there's a huge segment of the restaurant industry that's actually quite happy with this outcome.
The refrain we've been hearing lately is, most provinces and, of course, the federal government have a new Privacy Act, and we often hear that cited as a reason that this can't be done. What about those issues of privacy?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to information that's about individuals in particular, that's, I think we all need to collectively draw a line there. I think it's one thing to share aggregate information, but it's another thing to share information about an individual. But even here, I actually think there's a whole bunch of interesting and exciting innovation that's taking place. In the United States, for example, the White House has launched what's called the Green Button Initiative, where basically they've been getting utilities to sign up. And when you log into your utility, rather than just seeing, what your utility bill was and how much energy you used, on the website, you can push this button and download that information. And what you can actually do is link it to an app. And so now there's developers across North America who are building applications that use your personal information that you choose to share with them, but they offer you advice on how you could be saving energy and how you could be reducing your carbon footprint at home or at work or wherever. So all this innovation now becomes possible, not because the government shares your personal information with anybody, but they share it with you, and they give you the power to now pass it on and share it with whoever you want.
When you make your pitch to government, how well received are you? Do you get a lot of pushback?
Actually, I think one of the things that's interesting at the moment is there's a lot of people in government that know that we need to be rethinking the way we deliver services and the way that we engage with the public. And so my experience has been there's actually enormous appetite for these types of conversations.
So what's the overall community benefit then of a more open government?
Part of it can be around an increased ability to participate in conversations and public debates that are taking place in your community. So for example, if budget data and voting records and those types of information about your elected officials and the kind of operations of government is made more open, it now means that someone who goes to a city council meeting to, express concern about something that's going on in their community can arm themselves with more information. When they show up, they're better informed, so they can make their case more effectively. That's kind of the grassroots level of kind of open government that actually gets me quite excited. But the other part of it is allowing us to rethink the way we deliver services. So with the restaurant inspection example I told you earlier, we no longer think of the government website as the place where you go to find out about government information. Instead, we try to embed government information in all the places where you would normally look, like restaurant review websites and apps on your phone and places like that. So how do we get? So it's, I think, causing governments to rethink how do we get the information we need to people in the place where they actually are, rather than making them go somewhere that they never go.
Do you think governments at all levels invest enough human resource and capital in new technologies and in, you were talking about apps and mobile applications and so on. Is enough attention being paid to that, and is there enough, do governments have the skill set to do it?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question, and I actually think it's one place where a lot of governments struggle. And one of the things that I often like to do when a government asks me my opinion on something is I often ask for the org chart for the government, which sounds like a very kind of old school thing to do, but it tells you a lot. And very often what you end up seeing is that the CIO, so the Chief Information Officer, which is often the person who's kind of nominally in charge of technology and thinking, and it's supposed to be thinking strategically about how technology and information should be managed for a government or for an organization. They often report into the Chief Financial Officer at cities and provincial governments. And it tells you a lot about what governments think about technology, is that they don't think of it as a strategic tool by which to rethink the relationship that they have with citizens. They think of technology as merely an implementation tool and really a bunch of guys who are just supposed to go do whatever they're told. And so you end up with, I think, a lot of CIOs who are not participating in really strategic conversations and helping governments reinvent themselves. Instead, they're kind of introduced after the fact and basically are just there to try to figure out how to implement what's already been decided.
Do you think it's a generational thing?
Definitely, that's part of it. But I think actually, the big thing is actually a leadership issue. There are a lot of older mayors who get that they need to rethink the way their city works, and they get hungry and they go and look for people who are doing interesting things, or they at least give the people who have ideas a long leash to go and run and test those ideas out. So I don't know that it has to be generational by any stretch. But where you see jurisdictions like Chicago and like the White House where people are really doing fascinating things, it's because the leadership has recognized, even when I don't understand all of this stuff, I know it's going to be a priority, and I just know it's going to make us more competitive and effective and make us stand out against our peer group 10 years from now. So we got to start doing it now, and they take the step and they give people permission.
Mr. Eaves, thanks so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.